Reverend Robert Schuller has died after a battle with cancer. Schuller is best known for his message of possibility thinking, which he preached from his Southern California Crystal Cathedral. But the ministry declined in recent years and filed for bankruptcy in 2010.
Before the collapse, Robert Schuller was celebrated as a pioneer of modern televised Christianity, broadcasting hope from a revolutionary glass cathedral that drew global attention. His ministry appeared stable, influential, and unstoppable. Yet, beneath the success, tensions inside his organization and family were quietly escalating. Financial strain, leadership conflict, and internal disagreements were already in motion. What unfolded next was a dramatic downfall that transformed one of America's most famous religious empires into a cautionary story. A farewell inside glass walls that had already been sold. On April 20th, 2015, a black hearse slowly pulled up to one of the most recognizable religious landmarks in America, the Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California. It was the same glass structure where Robert Harold Schuller once stood and delivered sermons that reached millions of viewers around the world, preaching hope, possibility, and faith without limits. Inside the casket was Schuller himself, who had died 18 days earlier at the age of 88 in a care facility in Artesia after battling esophageal cancer that had gradually spread through his body over nearly 2 years. But by the time of his funeral, the place he built was no longer his. Years earlier, in the early 2000s, the ministry he founded had already entered financial collapse and bankruptcy proceedings. Control of the Crystal Cathedral had been transferred out of his organization and sold through a court-approved deal to the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange. What was once the centerpiece of a global Protestant broadcast empire was already in the process of being transformed into something entirely different, later renamed Christ Cathedral. Inside the building that day, a funeral service for Schuller was still held. But the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The pulpit where he once preached to packed Sunday crowds was gone. The congregation had changed. The atmosphere was quieter, smaller, and stripped of the global energy that once defined the space. After the service, his coffin was taken not deeper into the cathedral, but outside onto the grounds. He was laid to rest in the memorial gardens, in the same soil where his wife, Arvella Schuller, had been buried a year earlier after more than 60 years beside him. She had played a central role in building the ministry's broadcast legacy long before everything began to fall apart in the early 2000s. What made the moment even more striking was the contrast. The man who once told millions that anything was possible now rested beneath a property that had already been legally taken from his control. And this farewell was not just the end of a life, but the visible result of a collapse that had been building quietly for years, long before the world realized how far the fall would go. When the cathedral changed owners, the end of the Crystal Cathedral did not arrive as a single dramatic collapse. It unfolded quietly, step by step, until what once felt permanent began to feel unfamiliar. The final Protestant service inside the glass sanctuary took place on June 30th, 2013. That morning carried an unspoken weight. Many in the congregation already knew it was not just another Sunday, but a closing chapter to an era that had defined their faith for decades. A week later, the transition became real. The remaining members relocated to a former Catholic parish nearby, forming a new congregation they called Shepherd's Grove. It was not a fresh beginning born from growth, but a forced move born from necessity. The identity they had once built around the Crystal Cathedral name was left behind almost overnight. The property itself had already changed hands long before that final service. In November 2011, A bankruptcy court approved the sale of the entire 34-acre campus for $57.5 million to the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange. The decision marked a turning point that ended the ministry's independence and placed the future of the iconic structure into entirely different hands. Even at the time, the move shocked observers who had once seen the cathedral as untouchable. What followed was a transformation few could have imagined when the building first opened. The diocese invested tens of millions more dollars to redesign the space for Catholic worship. The central pulpit was removed and replaced with an altar. Religious symbols were added throughout the interior. The building was eventually renamed Christ Cathedral, reflecting a completely different tradition from the one Robert Schuller had built it for. By 2019, the transformation was complete when the cathedral was officially consecrated as a Catholic church. Thousands attended the first Mass, walking through the same glass doors that once welcomed global audiences to Hour of Power broadcasts. Even the famous Hazel Wright organ, once a centerpiece of Schuller's vision, had been removed years earlier and sent overseas for restoration, only returning nearly a decade later in 2022. Looking back, the irony becomes difficult to ignore. Schuller had once expressed confidence that the Catholic Church would preserve the building for generations, believing it would ensure the structure survived long after his ministry faded. In a sense, that belief came true, but not in the way he may have imagined. Because while the building survived, everything attached to his original vision was slowly erased. And as the walls of glass were redefined by a new faith, the story behind its founder was already moving toward its next chapter, one that began not with architecture or worship, but with debt, records, and a growing storm inside the institution he once controlled. The lawsuits that turned the founder against his own ministry. For many outsiders, the downfall of the Crystal Cathedral looked sudden, but inside the organization, the unraveling had already been building for years before the public fully noticed. By October 18, 2010, Crystal Cathedral Ministries officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, revealing a financial crisis far deeper than most supporters had ever imagined. Court filings showed more than $43 million in debt, including a massive mortgage tied directly to the iconic property that was once famously built without borrowing a single dollar. What shocked investigators even more was what appeared inside the financial records. According to court documents, members of the founding family had collectively received millions in compensation over the years leading up to the collapse. From the early 1990s through 2010, payouts to family members reportedly reached nearly $13 million. At the time of the filing, multiple relatives were still receiving significant annual salaries and housing allowances, even as the ministry struggled to meet basic financial obligations. At the same time, outside vendors were left waiting for payments that never came. Small suppliers connected to church events and productions reported unpaid invoices stretching back years. One supplier, who provided animals for long-running holiday pageants, said she was owed tens of thousands of dollars after decades of service. Others, including costume and production staff, described similar experiences of delayed or missing payments that slowly accumulated into financial and legal pressure. As the bankruptcy case unfolded, tensions inside the organization intensified. Leadership disputes escalated, and trust between board members and the founding family began to break down completely. In 2011, even family dynamics shifted dramatically when Robert Schuller's own daughter voted with the board to remove him from leadership entirely. The man who had once been the unquestioned voice of the ministry was now being pushed out by his own inner circle. Soon after, the conflict turned personal and legal. Schuller and his wife filed for personal bankruptcy. And later, in a highly unusual move, he attempted to file a claim against the very church he founded, arguing that his sermons, books, and name were intellectual property being used without proper rights. The court ultimately ruled against most of his claim, granting only a fraction of what he sought, and affirming that the ministry controlled the broadcast rights. It was a turning point that exposed how fractured everything had become. The empire was no longer just collapsing financially. It was breaking relationally, legally, and emotionally at every level. And as the founder found himself in court, facing his own institution, the next and most painful stage of the conflict was already forming inside his own household, where the battle was no longer just about money or control, but about legacy, loyalty, and family itself. The son, the father, and the collapse of trust. Inside the Crystal Cathedral, the most damaging conflict was not happening between critics outside the church, but within the family that built it. What had once been a tightly controlled ministry began to fracture in public view, with leadership decisions turning into quiet power struggles that eventually became impossible to hide. On January 22, 2006, Robert H. Schuller made a major decision that would reshape the future of the ministry. At 79 years old, he appointed his only son, Robert A. Schuller, as senior pastor of the Crystal Cathedral. It was meant to be a smooth transition, a continuation of the family legacy that had defined the church for decades. At first, it appeared to work. But beneath the surface, tensions were already forming. By 2008, the church board created a new leadership structure that significantly reduced the son's authority. What followed was a quiet but decisive shift in control. By October 2008, an official announcement confirmed that Robert A. Schuller would step down, citing deep differences in vision and direction between father and son. The carefully planned succession had collapsed in less than 3 years. In interviews that followed, the younger Schuller revealed how unstable things had become behind the scenes. He spoke about financial pressure, including the ministry spending millions annually on broadcast production and the board's decision to cancel his televised messages. What was once a global platform was shrinking rapidly, and internal decisions were being made without his influence. Later, he would reflect even more critically on the situation, suggesting that if his father had stepped aside earlier, the ministry might have preserved more of its stability and assets. He also pointed to growing concerns about leadership capacity and decision-making during the final years of his father's active control, raising uncomfortable questions about how long the transition should have taken. By 2010, leadership shifted again when Sheila Schuller Coleman, another child of the founder, took over the ministry. But within months, the organization entered bankruptcy, and by 2012, she had also stepped away, later describing a toxic internal environment within the church leadership. One by one, the Schuller children exited the ministry their father had built. 5 children had grown up inside that glass sanctuary. All 5 eventually left. And as the last of them walked away, the question inside the ministry was no longer about succession or leadership. It was about survival. Because what was happening inside the family was only a reflection of something even larger beginning to fail. And that failure would soon become impossible to ignore as the empire reached its final public peak before collapse. The peak of a global church empire. Before the controversy, the bankruptcy filings, and the internal collapse, the Crystal Cathedral stood as one of the most influential religious institutions in the world. At its height, it was not just a church, but a media-driven empire that reshaped how modern Christianity was presented to the public. The cathedral itself, completed in 1980, was an architectural statement unlike anything in American religious design at the time. Designed by Philip Johnson and John Burgee, it was built almost entirely of glass, more than 10,000 panes in total, reflecting Schuller's belief that worship should feel open, visible, and accessible. The project cost roughly $18 million, all raised without loans, a point Schuller often emphasized as proof of divine provision and financial discipline. At the center of it all was the Hour of Power, which began in 1970 and eventually expanded into one of the most widely broadcast church programs in history. By the mid-1990s, it reportedly reached tens of millions of viewers across more than 180 countries. Presidents, celebrities, and global figures appeared on the program, reinforcing its influence far beyond traditional church walls. The ministry also became known for its large-scale seasonal productions, including Glory of Christmas and Glory of Easter, where elaborate stage designs, live animals, and aerial performers turned worship into a televised spectacle. These productions drew massive crowds and long-term sponsorship, further solidifying the cathedral's cultural reach. But hidden beneath the success was a growing dependency on expensive broadcasts and large-scale operations that required constant funding. The same global reach that made the ministry powerful also made it financially vulnerable when support began to decline. What once looked like an unstoppable expansion of faith and media influence was, in reality, carrying internal pressure that few outside the organization could see. And as that pressure continued to build through the early 2000s, the foundation that supported the entire empire was already beginning to weaken, setting the stage for a collapse that no amount of visibility could stop. The gospel of possibility and its hidden cost. At the core of Robert Schuller's influence was a message that set him apart from nearly every other major preacher of his era. Instead of focusing on guilt, sin, or judgment, he built his ministry around encouragement, self-worth, and what he called possibility thinking. It was a faith designed to uplift, to reassure, and to leave people feeling capable of overcoming anything. This philosophy was heavily shaped by Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, who had a major influence on Schuller's approach to preaching. Schuller often acknowledged that Peale's ideas shaped not only his ministry, but his entire worldview. In 1982, he expanded on this direction in his book Self-Esteem, The New Reformation, which he distributed widely to pastors across the country. Inside that book, he redefined traditional concepts in a way that sparked major debate. He described sin not primarily as moral rebellion, but as anything that damages a person's self-worth. Critics argued this shift weakened core Christian doctrine. Theologians such as John MacArthur publicly challenged his teachings, insisting that sin could not be reduced to self-esteem issues. Others, including R.C. Sproul, also raised concerns that Schuller's theology blurred essential biblical distinctions. Supporters viewed his message as refreshing, uplifting, and emotionally healing, while critics argued it represented a departure from foundational doctrine. This tension between the two interpretations followed him for decades and continued to shape public perception of his ministry. Over time, his theology influenced not only his sermons, but also the entire structure of his church. The organization was built around themes of encouragement, personal growth, positivity, and optimism, creating a culture centered on inspiration and forward movement. However, questions remained about what such a system would look like under pressure. It was never fully tested in moments of real crisis, when finances began to weaken, when leadership disagreements emerged, when internal structures were strained, and when trust among members started to fracture. These challenges eventually revealed gaps between the ideal message and the practical realities the ministry would later have to confront and navigate over time. Because a message built almost entirely on positivity leaves little space for collapse. And when the collapse finally came, the ministry found itself without a clear framework to explain it, confront it, or recover from it, leading directly into the final chapter of this story, where everything began far from glass cathedrals and global broadcasts, in a place much smaller and far more fragile than anyone expected. The beginning that foreshadowed the end. Long before the glass cathedral, the global broadcasts, and the financial collapse, Robert Harold Schuller's story began in a place that looked nothing like the empire he would later build. He was born on September 16, 1926, in Alton, Iowa, into a Dutch Reformed farming family that lived through the hardships of the Great Depression. Life on the farm was simple, but it demanded resilience. Every day was shaped by work, survival, and faith passed down through quiet routines rather than grand speeches. One of the most defining moments of his early life came during his college years, when a tornado destroyed the family home. Instead of breaking them, it became a rebuilding story. Schuller and his father reconstructed what they could using salvaged materials, an experience he later described as formative in shaping his belief that setbacks could always be rebuilt into something stronger. After graduating from Hope College in 1947 and earning a Master of Divinity in 1950, he married Arvella de Haan and entered ministry in the Reformed Church in America. A few years later, in 1955, he was sent to Garden Grove, California, with almost no resources and no established congregation. He began preaching in the most unexpected place, the Orange Drive-In Theater. Every Sunday, families would sit in their cars while he delivered sermons from the roof of a snack bar. There were no stained glass windows, no cathedral walls, only open sky and uncertainty. Yet, this humble beginning slowly attracted attention and grew into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. This unlikely start eventually laid the foundation for a growing congregation that would continue expanding over the years, transforming a simple drive-in gathering into a recognized and influential church movement in the region and beyond over time later. From that drive-in roof, he built what would eventually become the Crystal Cathedral and the Hour of Power, reaching millions across the world at its peak. But standing at the very end of this story, that origin now reads differently, because what began with resilience and open skies eventually ended beneath glass walls that could not hold the weight of everything built upon them. And in that contrast between beginning and ending lies the full meaning of his journey, a rise that seemed unstoppable until the silence finally came. Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Watch the next video on screen for more stories that go beyond what you usually hear.